This is SB Veda of the Global Calcuttan, and pleased to be joined by author, lawyer, and entrepreneur Dan Burt. I first met Dan at World's Literary Festival 2014 in Norwich, England, where we were both invited to read. Dan's angry poetry and eclectic life experience struck a chord with me, so I asked him to join me in conversation. He from his vacation home in Maine, while I sit in Calcutta courtesy of Skype, making this the first truly global edition of our series, Calcutta Conversations. We at the magazine are interested in how people travel the contours of cultural space-time and manage the orbits of different worlds along the way. Well, Dan Burt is no stranger to these forces, having inhabited many such planets, beginning with his upbringing in the crime-ridden working-class area of South Philadelphia called the Tenderloin. Dan's father was a butcher, and his mother the child of a Jewish crime family called the Kavitches, who ruled the Tenderloin fearsomely. Of course, the mean streets tend to keep many in their grip, but Dan clawed his way out, reading English at Cambridge, then studying law at Yale. It was a meteoric rise for the former butcher's apprentice. He added writer to his resume incredibly at age 65, and in this career, too, he has excelled. His work has been published in PN Review, the Sunday Times of London, and Granta, among others. His writing draws upon his inhabitants of radically different worlds, from the strife of South Philly to the rocky seas off New Jersey, to managing the currents of Washington, New York, Riyadh, and finally London, where he has been living, working, and writing since 1994. Last year, Notting Hill Editions published his memoir, You Think It Strange. Not only does it place his poetry in context, but it is also a truly riveting read, and I'll let him speak about it. Dan, thank you for being here, and welcome.
Well, Sujoy, thank you very much for your interest in taking the time to introduce me and talk to me, and to introduce me to a new technology, Skype. As I told you before this began, this is my first experience of it. If I screw it up, put it down to old age. What I thought I would do is read 4 very short excerpts from the memoir, this here, so I can hold it up and you can see it, called You Think It's Strange, and they'll give you some idea of the world I came from. First, from a section called Ancestral Houses, is a part titled Fourth and Bailey. Joe Burt, my father, was born in Boston in 1916, almost 9 months to the day after his mother landed there from a shtetl near Kiev. She brought with her Eva, her firstborn, and Bernie, her second. Presumably my grandfather, Louis, Zeta, Pop, was pleased to see my grandmother Rose, or Mom, even though she was generally regarded as a chaleria, a shrew in Yiddish. Zeta had been dragooned into the Russian army a little before the outbreak of World War I. Russia levied a quota of Jewish men for the army from each shtetl, and these men invariably came from the poorest shtetl. Zeta deserted at the earliest opportunity, which was certainly not unusual, made his way to Boston, and sent for Mom. Mom and Pop moved the family in 1917 to a small row house at 4th and Daly in South Philadelphia, the city where my father grew up, worked, married, and in 1995 died. Pop was a carpenter, Mom a seamstress, both socialists at least, if not communists. Mom was an organizer for the International Lady Garments Workers Union, which seems in character. Yiddish was the household tongue, my father's first, though Pop spoke and read Russian and English fluently. Mom managed Russian well, but English took more effort. The family's daily newspaper was Vorwärts, printed in Yiddish. Vorwärts published lists of those killed in pogroms when they occurred. Ukrainian Cossacks allied themselves with the Bolsheviks and used the Russian Civil War as an excuse to continue the pogroms that had been a fact of Jewish life in the Pale from the 1880s. Pop was hanging from a trolley car strap on his way home from work in 1920 when he read the names of his family among the dead, all 18 of them, father, mother, sisters, brothers, their children. He had become an orphan. He never went to shul again. A few years later, he learned how they were killed, when some of Mom's family, who had hidden during the raid, emigrated to America. I heard the story from him when I was 10, at Christmas, 1952. I came home singing Silent Night, newly learned in my local public elementary school. I couldn't stop singing it, and went caroling up the back steps from the alley into our kitchen where Pop, putty cup, in his mid-60s and dying of cancer, was making what turned out to be his last visit. Veda had cause to dislike Gentile sacred songs, though I didn't know it. He croaked, "Danala, shashtil," and I answered, "No, why should I?" His face flushed with all the life left in it, and he grabbed me by the neck and started choking. My father pulled him off, pinioned his arms, and when his rage had passed, led me to the kitchen table where Veda sat at the head and told me this story. The Jews had warning of a raid. Pop's father, my great-grandfather, was pious and reputed to be a malama, a learned though poor Orthodox Jew. As such, he was prized and protected by the community. Pop's in-laws urged him to take his family and hide with them in their shelter below the street. Great-grandfather refused. He said, so I was told, "God will protect us." The Cossacks rousted them from their house and forced everyone to strip. They raped the women while the men watched. Done, they shot the women, then their children, and last the men. They murdered all 18 of them, my every paternal forebear excepting Pop, who died an atheist, as did my father. My mother's side of the family were rather different. They also came from Russia, the men at least. The women came from Italy. And they came from Odessa, which was an area known to be heavily populated with Jewish gangsters. And my mother's family came from 9th and Race, about 1.5 miles from where my father was born. And this is a section from You Think It's Strange, called 9th and Race. Prostitution, gambling, fencing, contract murder, loan sharking, political corruption, and crime of every sort were the daily trade in Philadelphia's Tenderloin, the oldest part of town. The Kevich family ruled this stew for half a century, from Prohibition to the rise of Atlantic City. My mother was a Kevich. Not all Jewish boys become doctors, lawyers, violinists, and nobelists. Some sons of immigrants from the Pale became criminals, often as part of or in cahoots with Italian crime families. A recent history calls them tough Jews, men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who organized and ran Murder Incorporated for Lucky Luciano in the 20s and 30s, and Arnold Rothstein, better known as Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby, who fixed the 1919 Baseball World Series. The Kevich family were tough Jews. My mother's uncle, Uncle Al, whose name has now become something of a staple at my college in Cambridge, St. John's, is the next section I'll read you. My mother's brother, Albert, was a taciturn man. He lived with his wife, Babe, named Marian Dorazia, and their 4 girls in a row home at 24th and Snyder in South Philadelphia's Italian neighborhood. He had no son. Babe was a great beauty, hence the nickname which she still proudly bears at 92. And her daughters were beautiful as well. From the street, their house looked like any other working-class row home in the neighborhood. But inside it brimmed with toys, televisions, clothes, and delicacies. The daughters were pampered and much envied. Education for Uncle Al, Aunt Babe, and their daughters stopped with South Philly High. They attended neither church nor synagogue. There were no books on their tables or art on their walls, except the mural of a bucolic Chinese landscape in their living room. Uncle Al was a detective on the Vice Squad, the Philadelphia Police Department's special unit charged with reducing prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, fencing, protection, and other rackets. The opportunities for corruption were many. Some said the vice squad's function was to protect vice. Clarence Ferguson was the head of the vice squad. Babe's sister was Ferguson's wife. We went to visit Uncle Al's house one Sunday when I was 10. A week before, Billy Meade, the boss of the Republican Machine in Philadelphia, had been shot and nearly killed in the club. That was a club that my mother's family owned, an after-hours drinking club. He was drinking in the early hours at his accustomed spot on the bar when someone shot him with a silenced pistol shoved through the inspection grill on the door when it slid aside in answer to a knock. The shooter was short. He stood on a milk crate to fire through the grill and must have known Meade could be found in the club in the wee hours of Sunday morning and where along the bar he customarily stood. Billy Meade and Big Milt, Uncle Al's father, my grandfather, were on the outs at the time, and Meade had done something that caused Big Milt real trouble. Uncle Al was just 5'5", had ample experience with and access to firearms, and would have known Meade frequented the club. I watched the police take Uncle Al from his house that morning and confiscate a large chest containing his sword and gun collection. He was tried but not convicted because the weapon used was never found, and Babe said he had been making love to her in their marriage bed when the shooting occurred. No one else was accused of the attempted murder, and when Meade recovered, he made peace with Big Milt. They both died of natural causes. Some years later, Uncle Al was again involved in the shooting. This time there was no question that he was the shooter. He had stopped for a traffic light in the rough neighborhood on the way home. 4 young black men approached his car. According to Al, they intended to carjack him. I never saw Uncle Al without his gun, a .38 police revolver he wore in a holster on his belt. When he drove, he always unholstered the gun and laid it on the seat beside him. One of the men tried to open the driver's door, and Uncle Al grabbed his gun from the seat and shot through the window, seriously wounding him. The other 3 fled, and Al chased them, firing as he went. He brought down a second, and the other 2 were picked up by the police a short time later. The papers were full of pictures of the car's shattered windows, the 2 black casualties, and the white off-duty detective who had shot them. The police department commended him for bravery. I never saw Uncle Al angry. Crossed, he stared at me coolly, diamond blue eyes, and sooner or later, inevitably, even the score and more. The last brief passage I'll read is about the sea area, the coastal area of New Jersey, where my father became a charter captain after having spent most of his life as a butcher. Ducks and geese rose quacking and honking out of the bay's salt marshes at daybreak as the charter boats headed for the inlet. Ribbons of them streaked the skies heading north in spring and south in fall. Clouds of gulls wheeled above the bars and beyond the breakers off the beaches and dived on fleeing baitfish. The sun rose like a new penny from the sea's edge as we'd head offshore. Helmsmen squinted into it to avoid flotsam and keep their course. It dyed rose red and blinded them again when they were heading home. Whitecaps form when the wind rises above 10 knots, and the sea backs glow mint green. Beyond the 60-fathom line, ocean turns magnolia green. There were no vomiting drunks, no aprons with rust-brown, dried pork blood, no customers demanding cuts from the front of the case, no cops on the take, no rats behind rice sacks, no registers, no pushcart men and boys huddled round oil drum trash fires waiting for trade. There were no Jews remembering pogroms, no hitmen, no bullies. Barnegat Light was his blessed isles, and Joe fell in love with the sea. And I read that sitting in my library in Maine with a sea in front of me.
Wonderful. With regard to the sea, it provided you the opportunity, I think, to connect with your father in a very different way than during your childhood, because he was, shall we say, a very harsh man for whom to be a son, really, to be a son to, authoritarian, violent, and yet on the sea, the sea calmed him, right? To an extent.
Well, the sea, one, your analysis is correctly right. It is exactly right. It enabled me to see another part of him and indeed to connect with him on a basis other than either labor or fighting. The sea was the place where he expressed love, and he loved the sea. It didn't calm him. It positioned him. It was a world that seemed rational and fair to him as far as I could tell. It was something that he genuinely cared about as opposed to being imposed upon him. The world he grew up in, he was the third of 4 children. They were poor. It was depression in America. It was particularly tough on many of the immigrants. My grandfather lost his job very quickly. I didn't think my grandmother continued to work. But she didn't have much. She was a piece worker. She sewed clothing got paid by the piece. And I chose these sections with a view, of course, this being broadcast in India, where some of the things that the Americans went through and are still going through are very much a part of current concerns there. Mm-hmm. And so my father had to leave school at in the 8th grade at 13. And he'd become, his hobby was prize fighting. He was a semi-pro boxer. And all he ever knew was fighting and scrabbling, trying to make a living in a fairly harsh world. The sea, he loved in and of itself. It wasn't something imposed upon him. He was still pretty violent. There was during my days as a public figure in America, there were a number of books published in which I was featured. One, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was about a major case I did. And in that, I described the way my father would kill sharks. And the way you kill a shark when you're out charter fishing, is you put a rope around the tail. It's a pretty good sized shark. You put a rope around the tail, and you tie one end to a cleat on one side of the stern. You have a gaff, what we call a flying gaff, rope in the hook, tied to the other side. And then my father would beat the shark to death with a boat hook. And he enjoyed pummeling that shark's head. So the violence wasn't gone, but he did love it. And the connection there with him was something that gave me an alternative to the harshness that I saw and the way I was trained. And interrupt me, please, whenever you want. I was trained to fight by my father. There's a section in the book about his teaching me how to box.
I was going to mention that you learned how to fight from him.
Yes, I did. And I don't think that was natural. I think the toughness and hardness that I had was not natural. I think given in a different family, I would have been an intellectual. Mm-hmm. I would have had a passion for music, art. They're all around me as I sit here. I wouldn't have been the public man that I became. It sounds too pompous. I wouldn't have been a fighter, I don't think. I don't like fighting, but it was what I knew, and it was necessary to defend yourself. I mean, it wasn't essential. It was that was the way I lived. That was what my father taught me.
You grew up in a tough neighborhood. In fact, I think your mother, there's an incident when your mother actually encouraged you to fight with a bully on your street, right?
Yeah, she dragged me out. I was 5 years old. I was scared to death. We just moved into this neighborhood, and these kids, one in particular, was terrorizing me. And I came in crying. My mother said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, Tommy Mann is, it's going to beat me up. I can't go outside." And she said, "Go back out and fight him." I refused. She dragged me down the back steps. I said, they'll gang up on me. And she grabbed the broom when she walking down the back steps, into the alley we lived on. And she said to the kids standing there, "If any of you interfere, I'll hit you with the broom." And then she made me fight him. This is significantly bigger than me, and I acquitted myself well. I was enraged, but there wasn't much in the way of protection. She treated my brother, my younger brother, quite differently.